All right, matrics, our next video is on variation and Lamarckism, and we're on page 272. And before I begin on variation, it's going to be very important for you to know the definition of two vital words which are going to be the foundation of your explanation when it comes to the formation of a new species. And I can't stress to you how important it is to know the exact definitions of these next two words, because in the final exam, you're more than likely going to be asked to define one of the two, or you're going to have to use both of these words in a lengthy explanation. And if you use them incorrectly, if you define them incorrectly, you're often going to lose a lot of unnecessary marks. In particularly, the definitions need to be word for word. They need to be verbatim. And there are some key words that you must include in your definition. And so the first word you're very familiar with, which is species. And if you look at the definition in your textbook, it refers to a species as a group of organisms that are able to breed amongst themselves, but not with any other species, and produce viable offspring. Viable meaning fertile. And the key words that you must include when you write the definition is that it is a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is really important. If you forget any one of those aspects, you probably won't get the full marks. And this is an example of one of those tricky questions where the mark allocation is often out of 2, but you have to give 3 things in order to get the 2 marks. And why are they so stringent on this? Well, a definition is a level 1 question, so it's a very simple piece of work, which means you need to know it really, really well. There's no other way to interpret it. It's either that exact definition or nothing else. And likewise with the word population, and we know this word as well from previous grades, even all the way back to grade 8. What is a population? And if we look at what a population is, it's a group of individuals of the same species occurring in a particular habitat. Now, something that I may want to add to that, and I suggest that you do add this to your textbook definition, is that they are a species at the same time and the same place that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And that's really important to not forget same time, same place. It's very similar in definition to species, so it's likely that sometimes these two can be confused, but ultimately the main difference between the two is the location. And so with these two definitions of what exactly is a species and what is a population, we now need to look at how does the variation within a population, within a species, how does this variation lead to evolution? And the factors that contribute to variation, there are a number of them. And the first one is meiosis. And we already know from previous lessons that meiosis creates variation via things like crossing over and random arrangement. And that changes our genetic variation. Another form of variation that can arise is from mutations. And remember, mutations are due to a mutagen of some kind, or it can also be a failure to go through transcription and translation correctly, where the transcription, the transcribed piece of DNA is not correctly taken down. That might be because nucleotides have been deleted or inverted or replicated too many times. And so there might be some kind of mutation. The third contributing factor is chance fertilization. And chance fertilization is what are the chances that that specific ovum and that specific sperm cell were the two gametes that fused to make that individual. Now, why is variation so important to know about evolution? Is because variation allows for evolution to take place. A species has a variety of genetic differences, genetic variations. How did it get those genetic variations? Well, they got it through meiosis, mutations, and chance fertilization. And these variations in the genetics allows for evolution to take place. And a example of variation perhaps in humans would be something like eye color. We have variations of eye colors. Blue eyes is a mutation that created variation amongst us. And so in having these slightly different eye colors, hair colors, if we had fur, different textures of fur, if we had variations in beaks, if you're a bird, these variations allow for evolution to take place. And the reason for that is ecological niches. Do you have a physical structure that is going to allow you to exist in this niche? And if not, is there variation in the population that would allow those of you that do have this favorable characteristic to be used, and so that more organisms can inherit this useful characteristic? Or if you don't have any useful variation, this might lead to possible extinction, or for you to find a new niche that you could fit into. Can I also say that in the final exam, when they ask to provide sources of variation, and you write meiosis, mutations, transfertilization, those would be the ideal answers. It's important that when listing something like meiosis as variation, you list it only as meiosis. And what I mean by that is, if you were to list random arrangement, crossing over, and then meiosis, if that was the combination that you put down on your paper, you would get 1 out of 3. And the reason for that is the first two, crossing over and random arrangement, are part of meiosis. So unfortunately, it's actually seen as all the same answer, and unfortunately, you would get 1 out of 3. However, and this is where it gets tricky, if you listed crossing over, random arrangement, and mutation, you would get 3 out of 3. And this is why it gets really tricky at the end of the year and how to answer this. And so effectively what I'm telling you is, please try not to use examples of how variation is created within any one of these 3. So please don't use examples of how variation occurs in meiosis, or how variation occurs in mutations, or how variation occurs in chance. If they ask you to give 2 factors that create variation, then provide something like meiosis, mutation, or chance fertilization. If, however, they ask you, how does meiosis create variation? Well, now you can mention the crossing over, the random arrangement, the independent assortment. That's when you can list those types of factors that contribute to variation. Now, with all this in mind, and having a fairly good understanding of the fact that a species has variation within it, and populations therefore have variation within it, we can now look at types of variation within populations. So the first one we're going to look at is continuous variation. And in general, genetics have a variety of outcomes. And what that basically means is that if you were to look at height in humans, for example, Height in humans varies in a very general way, and there are so many different heights and intermediate heights in between those. So if we were to make everyone in the class stand up and arrange everyone from tallest to shortest, there are plenty of in-betweens that may not be represented in that particular class, but doesn't mean they don't exist. And so these intermediate heights, all these little in-between values, you know, between the tallest person and the shortest person, creates a lot of variation. And these variations are responsible for the most new adaptations in the species. In other words, the more variation there is in a population, in a species, the more likely it is for the species to successfully evolve and adapt. The fewer variations they may have, the more difficulty they may have in evolving. And this then plays into the environmental component around evolution. In order to survive, you really need to be able to adapt to your environment. And I really want you to understand what that means. That doesn't mean that an organism chooses to adapt to an environment. It doesn't mean that it has made a choice, that it has physically forced itself to change. At the end of the day, you either have the characteristic that allows you to survive and change and evolve and suit the new environmental condition, or you don't. And the beauty of continuous variation is all these little intermediates, all these little slightly different variations that might be favorable in the future. They might not necessarily be not beneficial at the moment, like they might not be negatively influential at the moment. You might just have variation. But in the future, these variations might be beneficial to how the environment has changed. Other examples of continuous variation are things like, for example, the amount of fruit a tree makes, the size of a dog breed, and that's like continuous variation. And I also want to pause on dogs for a little bit as well, because they're a great source of information when we talk about continuous variation, in that dogs are one species, but there's so many varieties of dogs that it gives us the impression that they're somehow all different species, but they're not. They're one species, and they're just a variety. And effectively, dogs evolved from wolves, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on when we do artificial selection. But that means that the wolf genome houses all the physical variations that we see in dogs today, all the different colors, sizes, temperaments, so like their behavior, all of those different variations of phenotypes can all be found in the wolf genome. And this variation allows them to be really successful, and perhaps in the case of dogs, they are artificially selected for, so their desirability is based on humans, whereas if we were talking about perhaps organisms that aren't influenced by humans, if they were trying to survive, it's important to have variation, because the more variation there is in a population, the more likely it is to survive if the environment were to change. This now then brings me to discontinuous variation, and this is when characteristics exist in an either-or type of way. So either you have it or you don't, and there are no intermediates. And so an example might be something for the gene to roll your tongue. I know that that's a little bit of a myth-busted one, so maybe another good gene that you might have or might not have would be something like the widow's brook, which is where your hair comes down into a point in the front of your head, in your forehead. Some people have that, some people don't. Maybe another one that you're familiar with is your earlobe. Is your earlobe loose and unattached, or does it attach straight to the side of your head, to the side of the skin that's just above your jaw? And that's having an either or way. And the problem with discontinuous variation is the ability to survive. In other words, it makes it a little bit more tricky to survive if we only had discontinuous variation, because that means you either have the thing and you survive, or you don't have the thing and you die. And so it's a good thing that with more continuous variation, you allow the chances of your species to survive better. Another type of discontinuous variation in humans as well can be things like blood type. You either are A, you're O, AB, or B, and then also something like your sex. All right, so now we need to look at the different theories surrounding evolution. So the first theory we're going to look at is Lamarckism. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French naturalist, and he was one of the first people to propose that organisms undergo change over time as a result of some natural phenomenon. At the time, he didn't know necessarily what natural phenomenon it was, but Darwin actually filled in all of those blanks and improved upon the theory of evolution. And Jean-Baptiste's theory is composed of two main concepts. And the first one is his idea of use and disuse. He said that when an environment changed, the organism actively responded to survive the new environment. For example, the more an organ was used, the more efficient it became, and if it was not, it would eventually disappear. Now, there's a few issues from the offset here that we would see in this description, and that is the organism actively responding. That literally means that the organism is choosing to change. And unfortunately, that's not how evolution works. An organism cannot choose to want to change. It cannot choose to decide to make its feet webbed. Now, because it's living in an aquatic environment, it must now have webbed feet. Or it cannot choose to grow fur if it gets colder, where it didn't have any fur in the beginning. And likewise, if the organ already existed, like maybe the eyes, just because it started to use its eyes more at nighttime, maybe to hunt, doesn't mean that now its eyes are going to improve every single night. So in other words, the more it hunted at night, the better the eyes could see at night. That's not how evolution works. And that then brings you to the second aspect of this theory, which was the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which means the phenotypic changes acquired by parents during their lives are passed on to their offspring. Now, just by looking at that definition, there are some issues with that. The first being phenotypic. You cannot change your genetics based on any physical changes you do to yourself. So that means if you dye your hair a different color, you are not changing the genetics that you have. You're changing your phenotype. You're not changing your genotype. At the time, Lamarck didn't know that because he had yet to have any information on genetics. Mendel was not around yet at the time. And so there wasn't a lot of widespread knowledge on genetics just yet. So at the time, they only had to work on physical things you could actually physically see. And he thought then that if an organism changed themselves physically during the course of their lifetime, that change could then be passed on to the next offspring. That offspring could change even further and improve it by using it more. And that could then be passed on. And you can see how it goes on and on and on and on and on. A really good example of this is put up on the board here, where it is the basic idea of Lamarckism. And so what he starts off by saying is there's some kind of internal urge within the organism. Now, we already know that this doesn't really make sense because an organism can't want to evolve. It doesn't happen that way. He does, however, point out very interestingly that there is some kind of environmental change. And that does link into the idea of Darwinism, but not how we need it to. So he says that there's some change that happens in the environment, and there's a new need. And that need is generally a basic need, perhaps something like reproduction or the ability to eat or territory. Some very basic needs need to be fulfilled. And it can go one of two ways. There's a new need. So perhaps you start to use an organ more. That use of the organ more means that the structure becomes better, more developed, and you can then inherit that, or should I say, pass that on to your offspring. And now, with this new physical phenotypic change, you now have a new species. And you can see the problem with that because if you just use a simple example of humans, for example, and you think of something that we use more of and how it might change our physical appearance, it would be something like a bodybuilder. Just because a bodybuilder uses their muscles more and develops them more doesn't mean that they are going to be able to pass those bigger muscles onto their offspring. So now you can see how this theory really struggles to explain the inheritable part of genetics and how inheritance affects evolution. And so Lamarck at the time only had to work with physical things that he could see. And so now we know that this is obviously not the case. But we really need to focus on the two ideas he mentions, which is the use or disuse of an organ, and then the inheritance of that acquired characteristic. And a great example, a very common example that is almost always used in textbooks is that of Lamarck's giraffes. And his theory was that giraffes started off with short necks and slowly stretched them over time because there was less and less food available on the lower branches. Now, there might be some truth to some of this statement. So, did giraffes begin their existence with a short neck? Yes, they did, but not modern giraffes. We're talking ancestral giraffes. In other words, their common ancestor may have had a short neck, and based off of fossil records, we can conclude that they did have short necks. And the second thing that might be true in this statement is food availability was changing. The environment was changing. So those two ideas are true, but his explanation of how we went from a short neck to a long neck is where the issue comes up, and that is that the giraffe had an internal urge to control its physical characteristic and stretch its neck and somehow grow another vertebra or elongate the vertebra it already had, pass that on to its offspring. Its offspring continue to stretch its neck, grow another vertebra, elongate the vertebra, which is an acquired thing, and then pass that on to its offspring. And over time, its neck got longer. The problem with this is, of course, like we mentioned earlier, you cannot change your genetics based off of any physical things you do to your body. The only way you can change your genetics is through meiosis and mutations. Now, because this is also a very common example, the giraffe, Lamarck's giraffe is a very common example. Please don't use it to describe Lamarckism in an exam if they've actually given you another example. In other words, if they've given you an animal and they want you to describe Lamarckism for that animal, please only describe for that animal. If they were asking you to describe how Lamarck may have suggested how horses evolved, please do not start talking about Lamarck's giraffes. You need to fit the explanation to the example that is given in the exam. So that's it for this lesson. Please make sure that you're really comfortable with the idea of Lamarckism and also comfortable with the idea as to why it doesn't necessarily function as a explanation for evolution.